All right. As I said, we're in Acts chapter 24. I mentioned last Sunday that the notes were on the back table. I had forgotten, I hadn't put them out yet. But they were at the end of service. They were out there after the last prayer of the service last Sunday, because I realized they weren't on the table. So Acts chapter 24 and 25 are on the same piece of paper, just like we've been doing the last couple of weeks, trying to put two different chapters, save some paper and ink and so forth. Well, not ink, I guess, but paper. All right, so we've been discussing how that in Acts chapter 23, 22, all of this has come about because Paul went to Jerusalem knowing full well he was going to face persecution there. He was grabbed in the temple on the seventh day of Aval with some other brethren in support of the civil binding of the Mosaic law. He was taken before the Sanhedrin. He has now been taken because of the threat against his life and the fact that Lysias, the commander, didn't really know what else to do. He had already appealed to the Sanhedrin trying to figure out what was going on, what the issues were. He knew enough to be able to say, which, I mean, obviously, it has some issue to do with their law, but there wasn't much more he could do. And then add that to the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen. This was a case of these people were fully intent on killing a Roman citizen, and that certainly couldn't happen under Lysias' watch. So he sends him by night on to Caesarea. This is where Felix the governor is. And so at the end of chapter 23, we see here at the bottom that Felix, of course, here's the letter. We talked about this, and of course, it's not that's why I say it's not exactly a lie, because he did find out that Paul was a Roman citizen. I guess you could say deceit and lie is kind of the same thing. He just put it out of order deliberately so as to make it seem innocent, when in fact he had taken him in prison and was planning on scourging him, and then found out he was a Roman citizen. But anyway, so he goes to Felix here, and in verse 35, "I'll hear you," Felix says, "when your accusers also have come." So he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So here in chapter 24, we pick up 5 days after Paul has gotten to Caesarea. It's taken 5 days for the Jews to kind of get a party together, get their, for lack of a better phrase, lawyers put together. Tertullus is going to be the one, or Tertullus, however you want to pronounce that in verse 2. He's going to be the one that's bringing the accusations against Paul. So we have in verse 1, "After 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus or Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul." I use that phrase loosely, but these are their accusations, their evidence. This is what they're accusing Paul of. Verse 2, "When he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, 'Seeing that though we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear, by your courtesy, a few words from us.'" So, kind of butters up Felix. That was the way of doing things. It's probably anything specific to Tertullus or Tertullus. But the idea is, let's start off kind of with this pleasantry. Okay, recognize the authority that Felix has, and with that is the status that goes along with it. But what's interesting is, and I'm gonna read. I've mentioned this before. Bob Harkrider's, he has a class book on Acts, and I like to look at it because it has a lot of the background and history of some of these places and some of the people. And I thought this was interesting what he had to say about Felix. He says Paul was summoned to the court, and Tertullus. I'm just going to say Tertullus. Okay. If y'all want to say, "Hey, Michael, it bothers me," Tertullus. Say Tertullus. I'll change it, but I'm going to say Tertullus because it's easier to say. "Began his prosecution by flattering Felix. Much of what he said about Felix was not the true reputation he held among the Jews, who in general were rebellious against him. Felix was a wicked and unprincipled ruler, who himself would be called to Rome 2 years later to stand trial and be removed from office. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote, 'With all cruelty and lust, he exercised the power of a king with the spirit of a slave. Felix was living in an adulterous,'" and so this is Bob picking back up, Felix was living in an adulterous relationship with his second wife, Drusilla, who had been lured away from another husband. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa the first, who killed James back in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. So I kind of thought that was interesting background on kind of to understand about Felix. Because even though the way Tertullus describes their affectations towards him, the fact is they didn't really like Felix at all. Never mind the fact that Felix himself, even though he married a Jewess, Felix himself, he wasn't, even if he had been converted or even if he had heard about the Mosaic law and so forth, knew the details of the Mosaic law, he certainly wasn't a practicing Jew or a proselyte or anything else. So as we noted here in verse 2 and 3 and 4, these are kind of the pleasantries from Tertullus to Felix. We see starting in verse 5 the accusations against Paul, and they're gonna bring several accusations against him. Starting in verse 5, we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So here's the first. And really, there's 3 accusations. Really. He's a plague. Well, what is he that he is a plague? He's a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. Okay, I can see how the Jews would see that, right? The sense that he goes somewhere and he spreads this, they call it dissension. He's teaching the gospel, but it ends up causing problems because the Jews don't like it. Okay, so really, who is it that's causing the dissension? Is it Paul or the Jews? Okay, were the Christians, or Paul for that matter, the one that was riling people up and causing violence? No. Okay, so the accusation itself is an error. He calls them a plague, and I'm presuming that he's associating plague because he's spreading dissension among the Jews. Well, it's the Jews who are sparking the dissension. It's not Paul. Paul's preaching the gospel. The Jews basically take an issue with that and cause violence as a result. So it's really the Jews who are doing it. But hey, they're the ones who are, or Paul's the one, the Christians are the ones who are offending us. Therefore, it's not our fault that we're mad and angry and we get upset and are violent because Paul's the one who said it. The second part of this is that he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Remember how we've talked about, especially through the first 10 chapters of Acts or so, how that many of the Jerusalem Jews, the Judean Jews, saw the gospel, and for that matter the church, not so much as a separate entity or the ending of the old law, the institution of a new law, but as just kind of an expansion of Judaism, kind of a throw-off, a spin-off, a sect. Just like you had the different, you had the Essenes, you had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, you had 2 or 3 other main divisions of these Jews. Well, now you have the Nazarenes. You know, it's just another one of kind of these divisions of Judaism. Whether or not Tertullus and the rest of the Jews, or particularly the high priest, understood that that's not what Paul was teaching, that's not what the Christians said, whether they understood that or not, it doesn't make any difference. This is the accusation, okay? But I think it's interesting that notice, why do you think, especially if Tertullus and the high priest Ananias and the rest of them knew full well that the Christians and Paul made no attempt to connect themselves to Judaism. In fact, the opposite. Okay? If they knew that full well, that they didn't claim to be a sect of the Nazarenes, why do you think Tertullus would make that charge to Felix? He's a lawyer. Why do that? Under whose jurisdiction and authority, then, if he's a sect of the Jews and he stands for a sect of the Jews, whose authority would it be to rule on it? The Jews. Yeah. I think this is a deliberate attempt by Tertullus and the Jews to say, this really is a Jewish matter. This is a Jewish issue that needs to be taken care of by the Jewish powers that be, which is the Sanhedrin. The fact that he's a Roman citizen, they don't address that or deal with that, but it really puts a conundrum before Felix, because the issue here at the root of it, at least the way the Jews present it, is this is an issue regarding the Jews, about the Jews, and only the Jews. Now that's not entirely true though, was it? Had Gentiles also been dissenting against Paul as well in other places? In Ephesus, all the Gentiles ran together and got together, getting mad and angry, trying to find Paul. They expel him, get him out of there. Okay, so it's not just the Jews that had issue. It's the nature of what Paul was teaching that caused issue with both Jews and the Gentiles when they didn't like what they were hearing. But Tertullus doesn't bring that up. He says this is a matter about the Jews. Okay, so it seems to me he's trying to frame this within the purview and jurisdiction of Jewish law. Since it has nothing to do with Roman law or Roman jurisdiction, let us handle this. Okay, and of course their means of handling it would be likely to kill Paul, although I'm not sure, again, this is putting Felix in a hard place because he's a Roman citizen, Paul is. As a result, I don't know, as a Roman citizen, could Felix allow him to be put to death by the Sanhedrin when the accusation had nothing to do with Roman law? I mean, I don't know the details of Roman law here, and I haven't read anything about that. It's possible that Felix might have allowed them to punish Paul in some form or fashion. But kill him, I highly doubt that would have been allowed under Roman law without a Roman accusation attached to it. Thoughts through verse 5? Oh, yeah. Yeah, an accident. It just, things happen. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, well, absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, well, we were just bringing him back to the Sanhedrin, and these non-affiliated Jews decided they wanted to kill him, and we can't find him. We can't bring him to justice. We're sorry. Yeah, that could very well have been something that they could have tried. Yeah. Anything else through verse 5? Yes, sir.
I know you're going to get to this in the next couple of verses, but those 6 and 7 seem to confirm exactly what you're thinking here. The charge is he tried to profane the temple. Well, what does Felix care about that?
Yep.
And we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law, but the commander Lysias came by.
He intervened. Yep, he intervened. And that's why I say verse 5, I tend to lean towards the fact that Tertullus and Ananias, the high priest, and the others, they knew full well that the Christians didn't claim to be a sect of the Jews at all. Okay, I think they knew that. Even though at the beginning of the church and its first established, I think there was a misconception about it. I think many of the Jews did kind of think of it as just a spinoff, as a sect of the Jews. But certainly people learned better, especially after the persecution started arising. And the main issues that were associated with Jesus being the Messiah, ending the old law, the introduction of the new law, people had learned better for the most part by this point, especially Tertullus and Ananias. They knew better. And so I think that they're framing this in this way for that purpose. Yeah. All right, so we get to verse 6. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to law. Is that true? Not that Paul tried to profane the temple. What actually happened? Okay, what did the Jews actually say Paul had done? That he did profane the temple. Not that he tried to, but we caught him before he could do it. That is not what happened. They saw Paul walking around with, I think it was Trophimus, and they assumed Paul had already taken him into the temple and defiled the temple. That was the initial accusation, that Paul already had defiled the temple. He already had profaned it by bringing a Gentile. And they seized him after the fact. Not as he was attempting to do so. So already there's some, what's the fancy term for lying? More of a kind of a legal lawyer term. Nice fancy word. What's that word?
White lie.
Not white lie.
Misconstrued.
Anyway, it'll come to me later. It'll come to me while I'm preaching. And I'll be like, oh, that's the word. Verse 6. Now, he even tried to profane the temple. We seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. Well, that's not entirely obfuscate. Obfuscate. Obfuscation is a word, but it's like muddies up the waters.
Dissimulating or dissimulating.
There we go. Okay, I think that's the word I was trying to think of. Where's my thesaurus? Yeah. So I think he's being a little disingenuous here by framing it the way that he does. Because it's interesting to me that because of the way he says this, notice we wanted to judge him according to our law. Well, was there anything lawful about what the multitude was going to do to Paul by taking him, seizing him in the middle of the temple, and then bringing him out by a mob and beating him and planning to kill him right then and there? Was there anything lawful about that? No. There was no due process. There was no standard of the Mosaic law being used there. So that's in and of itself, not to mention the fact that they had already believed that he had already profaned the temple. All of this, it's as if he's attempting to frame it not only as an issue, but this is a more specifically not worth your attention, Felix. He was attempting to profane the temple. We arrested him. We seized him. That's the idea. Although, yes, they did seize him, but it was a mob seizing him and started beating him, planning to kill him. Completely different situation. But we seized him. It's not that big a deal, Felix. This is not worth your attention. Let us handle it. And I think that's the deliberate purpose here in verse 6 of Tertullus saying what he says, not that he profaned the temple by bringing a Gentile in. Therefore, we had planned to kill him. Tertullus is trying to frame this in a way where it's a minor issue. Felix, this is of the Jewish law. This is the Jewish people. Don't bother yourself with this. You don't need to waste your time on this. And it's very deliberate on their part. So we're going to judge him according to our law, which even once he was in the Sanhedrin, okay, there was really no discussion of even accusations. Okay, in the middle of the Sanhedrin, at least what Luke gives us of chapter 23, there are no accusations levied at Paul. Okay, I'm sure that the Sanhedrin already knew what the accusations were, but really what happened was after Paul and Ananias had their dialogue, and then Paul mentions the resurrection, chaos ensues, and Lysias has to come to Paul's rescue again. So even when he was in an appropriate setting to be judged by their law, there was no levying of accusations. There were no witnesses presented. There was no due process even then. So again, this is all muddying up everything for Felix so that Felix is like, I don't want to get involved. Verse 7, but the commander Lysias, one of you Romans, came by with great violence, took him out of our hands. Luke doesn't record that there was any violence by the Roman guards against the Jewish mob that were beating Paul. Was there great violence? Yes, there was, by the mob against Paul. And possibly by the mob against the Roman soldiers, okay, for trying to prevent them from what they wanted to do, which was kill Paul. But Luke doesn't record anything about the soldiers smacking people around, hitting people. I'm sure there was some shoving. I'm sure there was some use of authority here. But it was in essence a mob that was, you're walking the line there of a riot. Okay? So, but notice how Tertullus frames this. He says the commander Lysias came as if they were in the middle of court proceedings. Notice that's the setting. We were going to judge him according to our law. We had him, we were prepared to judge him, due process using our law, but Lysias just kind of jumps in here, intervenes, and not only intervenes rudely, but violently, and took him out of our hands, verse 8, commanding his accusers to come to you. That is not how it happened. Okay, Lysias wanted to get to the bottom of it. He did not want, basically, the way Tertullus is describing this, Lysias is to blame for all this. Okay, this wouldn't even be before you if Lysias just left everything alone. Lysias sent him over to you, made us come to you, and this is just a huge ordeal, and it really doesn't need to be. When in fact, Lysias tried to get to the bottom of the situation to start with. He tried to find out from the people through Paul's dialogue. That didn't work. So he tried to find out from the Sanhedrin. That didn't work. And then he found out, of course, he had already found out about Paul being a Roman citizen. That complicated matters. And then the threat against Paul's life by these 40-some-odd individuals who were planning to assassinate Paul. Conspiracy, because the Sanhedrin, particularly the Sadducees of the Sanhedrin, it sounds like, were involved in that conspiracy to do that. So in verse 8, by examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. Verse 9, and the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. All right. I find it interesting that Tertullus says this, that he says, by examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. Well, notice he doesn't say you can find out that all the events that I've described are exactly what Paul's going to say too. That's not true. We know Paul wasn't going to say that either. He says the things of which we accuse him. Well, notice specifically the accusations. Verse 5 is really the main accusation of this. And it would be true, I guess, from a Jewish perspective regarding the fact that he's a plague and a creator of dissension. Yes, where Paul goes, where the gospel goes, people get angry about it, and they get violent. So yeah, from that perspective, Felix, technically as a third objective party, would probably be able to see how that would be true. The fact that he's a sect of the Nazarenes, the fact that Jesus was of Nazareth, the Nazarenes is kind of a little bit of a different deal there. The idea that this was a Jewish throw-off, Felix might not have been able to determine that. Paul might have had to spell that out for Felix, say, no, we are not associated with the Jewish law, but your Messiah came as a Jew and fulfilled Jewish law. So I could see how Felix could perceive that as well, as being, okay, I could see that supporting what the Jews are saying. Verse 6, he tried to profane the temple, we seized him. That's the only other accusation, that's the only part of this that I don't know that Felix would be able to examine Paul and ascertain to be true. Because Paul's going to address this issue. In his response here, he's going to address this. He never profaned the temple. He didn't take Trophimus. They assumed that he did. But it's almost as if he tried to. He even tried to profane the temple. So it's almost as if his intent was to. Not that he did. The accusation was he was intending to. Well, that's just the Jews' word versus Paul's. So Paul goes, I never intended to do that. So these accusations are wishy-washy. But I can see why Tertullus would say the things that he said to try to support his cause by saying, ask Paul yourself. Everything he says will confirm our perception of this at the very least. That's what he means.
We need to go into the conversation with a blank thought in his mind. He's been set up.
Yeah. Everything that Felix hears is going to be based on this type of filter because this is the framing of the situation that they put. Yep.
So by the time it gets to Paul, he's already got somewhat of an idea.
Yep.
And it could very well fall right into what he's been set up to.
Sure.
believe.
Sure. Absolutely. And again, this is the cleverness of the framing by the Jews and by Tertullus. Yes, ma'am.
Verse 8 to me doesn't read the way you're saying.
Mhm.
He's commanded the accusers to come unto Felix.
Mhm.
Okay? They commanded the accusers to come.
Yep.
And then he's saying by examining of whom thyself you may, find out what happened.
Yeah.
Because the accusers are going to testify to
Right.
has accused him of. And then the Jews in 9 assented to all of it and said, yeah, these things are so.
Yeah.
So it's not that he's telling him he's going to examine Paul, and Paul's going to say, yeah, that's what happened. The accusers are the ones that are going to say, yes, this is what happened. They assented to these things.
So, verse 8, you're saying that by examining him, you're saying that
They took him out of their hands, and they commanded the accusers to come unto Felix.
right.
Okay, so now the accusers, he's saying, by examining him, of whom thyself may take knowledge of all these things.
So you're saying by examining the accusers themselves is what you're saying here.
Right, they're going to testify.
Oh, I see what you're
They're gonna
saying.
say, yes, what Tertullus said is correct, and they assented in verse 9.
Okay. Well, now hold on a second. Let's see here. That's curious because I haven't read that. Let's see here. Acts chapter 24. We're in verse 8. Okay, so commanding his accusers to come unto him by examining of whom thyself may have knowledge of all these things. Well, that's interesting. Of whom? Accusers come unto you by examining of whom thyself. That could be. That could be. To investigate.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't even make sense that Tertullus would say, yeah, Paul's going to agree to this. I mean, Paul's going to agree to
Well, no, but regarding Felix's view of what Paul was going to say he actually did, I could see Felix saying, okay, Jews, I can see your problem with this.
Well, the law
Even though
would
Jew...
say, here's the proof.
Right.
Or the, the accusers.
That's interesting.
This is what they're agreeing to.
Yeah. That's really interesting. That's possible. Let's see. I didn't read what Bob wrote here. Let's see. Charges he makes against Paul, he's a pest. He's a pestilence. He stirs up insurrection among the Jews. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He tried to desecrate the temple. He implies that if the Jews had been left alone by Lysias, they would have given Paul a just trial by their law. The high priests and elders joined in by alleging these charges were all true. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I could see it either way you go with that, but the way the Greek phrases there, it does seem to lean more towards verse 8, by examining them, the examination of his accusers, you may ascertain these things which we accuse him. And even that accusing him, I think that is specific to Paul there, or in the Greek term there, verse 8. Yeah. Altos. Yeah, it's an individual.
And then the Jews backed him up and said, yep, that's what happened.
Yeah. Okay.
In 9.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I mean, I think even when, and of course Paul's defense, I think, the Jews had to know that Paul was going to be allowed to make a defense for himself. But even then, the way they framed it, they're hoping Felix will see it through their lens. Okay, but regarding verse 8, yeah, I'm with you on that. I think it certainly makes more sense as well, even though I could see it being Tertullus saying, hey, Paul's going to say some stuff, but everything he's going to say is going to back us up from our perspective. But it makes a lot more sense in verse 9, connected to it, that by examining the accusers, those who are going to actually tell you what happened who were there, because Tertullus wasn't there, or at least we don't read about Tertullus being there. It was Ananias and these other people from the Jews who can say specifically, this is what Paul said, or this is what he did or didn't do, or whatever. So yeah, okay, I appreciate that. All right, verse 8. Yeah, so that's interesting because the New King James, I've never really come across a point like that's kind of changes a little bit there how you read verse 9 and verse 8 connected. So that's interesting. Okay, thank you.
Well, at the end of verse 8 is the end of his conversation.
Yeah, that is. That's the end of the conversation there in verse
And then
8.
The Jews are behind going, that's right, that's what he said.
Mhm.
That's what happened. That's what I get verse 9 is they're saying he's right with what he said after he
Yeah.
his speech or his conversation. Jews were behind him, verse 9.
Yeah.
Maintaining and asserting, yeah, that's right. He's not the only one there. He's got Ananias.
Mm-hmm. People to back him up on that.
However many came with him.
Yeah. And that's what this little italics here. Usually these italics show the difference between the different manuscripts that the King James and the New King James are based on versus the American Standard. The American Standard apparently reads, they joined the attack, which would suggest that they didn't just nod their heads. There was some giving or dialogue between them and Felix to which they confirmed everything Tertullus said. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
I think, though, not to belabor the point, but the accusers haven't come yet.
Right.
Paul says in verse 19 at the end of his defense, they ought to have been here before the end to make the
Right.
accusation that they have brought against me.
Right. I think Tertullus, if again, go into this, that if verse 8, the Tertullus is describing these witnesses that are accusing Paul, I think he's just kind of coming to the end of his thing. Even if Paul gives a defense, just remember and understand that his accusers, when they get here, they will confirm everything that we've told you. I think is how Tertullus is framing that. So it would even serve even more to belittle Paul's defense, because everything Paul says, well, take it with a grain of salt, because his accusers will be here to back up what we've told you. So I could see that being the case.
I thought they were the accusers. So
You would think,
in the beginning of the chapter,
you would,
commanding his accusers, which is us,
right?
to come to you.
Yeah,
I did take it that way.
yeah, yeah, and yeah. When he says in verse 5, we have found, yeah.
Who are they if they're not?
And then commanding his accusers to come to you, verse 8. Of course, what we're going to find later is that the specific accusers revolved around the temple and the defiling of the temple. However, certainly Ananias, the high priest, and the rest of the Sanhedrin, they could acknowledge the fact that, yes, we had Paul in our midst regarding the judge him according to our law. We had him in our midst, and Lysias came and took him away. Again, yes, technically that did happen, but not the way they're describing it. So, I mean, I could see that as being their part of the accusers, but the specific ones that were involved in the initial tumult, they weren't there yet. It doesn't sound like. Yes, sir.
Keep in mind that under Jewish law, the accusers were the witnesses.
Yes.
They weren't
Eyewitnesses.
prosecuting attorneys or the counsel. It was the people who said, I saw it.
I saw this, I heard him say this, yada, yada. Yep. Yep. All right. So anything through verse 9? All right, because there are some accusers there currently, Ananias and those of the Sanhedrin, at the very least can say, yes, Lysias came in among us. We are the ruling power in Judea. Lysias took him away. Even though that wasn't the context of the situation, they could claim that, okay? The specific accusers, which we're going to find out later, they're false witnesses anyway. But the specific accusers and so forth are going to come later to support what Tertullus is saying. Verse 10 rather. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, and I think I read somewhere in Bob's record here that he'd been there 7 years. Yeah, now in his 7th year as procurator of Judea. For many years as judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Okay, so those 12 days that Paul's describing here, these specifically pertain to the events in Jerusalem. This is not including the 5 days that Paul has been there waiting for Tertullus and the rest of them to get there. Okay, that's why Paul says, verse 11, it has been no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship, in the context of the accusations. Because what we have is the first day back in chapter 21 and verse 17, Paul gets to Jerusalem. And then Paul, being with James and the other elders in 21 verse 18, they ask him, we want you to take this vow with these fellas. So, Paul, for 6 days, in verses 26 to 27, is fulfilling this vow. So then on this Ninth day, the tumult arising. So the first day Paul comes to Jerusalem. Second day we find he's with James and the elders. The third through the eighth day he's taking this vow. On the ninth day, which is the seventh day of the vow, he's grabbed by the mob. And then on the 10th day he's taken to the Sanhedrin. And then on the 11th day the plot against Paul's life is discovered. And the 12th day Paul's taken to Caesarea. So Paul's describing all the events from the time he got to Jerusalem to the time that he was sent to Caesarea. So that's why he says 12 days. That's not including the 5 that Paul's been waiting on. It's pertaining to the events in question, I guess you could say. Verse 12, they neither found me in the temple, disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, and I love that, they call it a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. All right, so notice how Paul first addresses the main issue that started everything, which was the issue with the temple. Okay, that's really what they assumed Paul had defiled the temple. Paul did not do that. Was Trophimus there in the city with him? Yes. But it's a far cry to say, oh yeah, he took him into the temple. They assumed he did, simply because Paul doesn't think the temple means anything anymore. So verse 12, when he says, they didn't find me in the temple disputing with anyone. Okay, I wasn't defiling it by causing a ruckus. I didn't incite a crowd. I didn't go into synagogues. I wasn't causing problems in the city. There was, in fact, Paul, for the majority of his stay in Jerusalem, he had been taking a vow with these other Jews, Jewish Christians, but other Jews, and this was involved in the service of the Mosaical law, the civil aspect of the Mosaical law. So all of this is baseless. They cannot prove the things of which they now accuse me. That includes the defiling or the attempted defiling of the temple. That includes also the fact that he is causing dissension among the Jews in the world, or that he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. None of those hold any water. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect. So Paul, in one verse here, verse 14, he both disassociates the law of Christ or the church from being a sect of the Jews or being associated to Judaism in any way, yet at the same time acknowledges from the fact that the same God instituted both. Notice, he says, according to the way they call a sect, which implies we don't call it a sect, it's completely different, so I worship the God of my fathers. Well, who under what law did his fathers serve? The Mosaical law. So Paul, on the one hand, separating the law of Moses and the way, the law of Christ, while acknowledging the same God gave both. I worship the God of my father, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets. I'm not rejecting the law of Moses. In fact, I accept everything in the law of Moses, including the fact that all things would be fulfilled with the advent of the Messiah. When he brought in, God would write the new law into the hearts of his people, that fulfilled that law. So everything Paul's saying, he is in harmony with the law of Moses. He is in harmony with the way. He's in harmony with Jehovah. Paul in no way is saying anything that is derogatory towards the Jews or disrespectful towards the law of Moses. Verse 15, I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and man. So notice 15, he describes the hope. And I think this is interesting, which they themselves also accept. Well, half of the Sanhedrin did. I don't know how much of the Sanhedrin is currently present there before Felix, but half the Sanhedrin did accept this. Okay? The other half, the Sadducees, had a major problem with it. But the idea that the majority of the Jews, the Sadducees were not by any means a majority of the Jews. They were a minority sect, but they had all the money. They had all the wealth, all the property, or the majority of it. And so that put them in great position of power. The majority of Jews, the biggest sect by far of all the Jews, were the Pharisees. They themselves did acknowledge and believe in a resurrection. So when Paul, he's describing here, verse 15, he's not saying the Sanhedrin. He's saying the Jews in general. I have a hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead. That is true. By and large, the Jewish people believed in a resurrection from the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, because I believe in this resurrection from the dead, I always strive to have a conscience without offense. Not just toward God, but toward who else? Toward men. I want to do everything that is decent according to law, that is orderly. I'm not running around trying to cause a ruckus. I'm not trying to draw people to myself for my own exalting of myself. So this idea that he's a ringleader, and again that suggests that the idea of a ringleader suggests a less than legal or a less than trustworthy association. The idea that this is a sect of the Jews, this is just a spin-off, it's not worthy of any attention. The idea that he is causing problems in other places, no, it's other people causing problems with what Paul says. All of this, Paul addresses. Anything through verse 16. Brilliant, it really is brilliant, because he addresses everything while still presenting his personality, his conscience, all of this, the innocence that is associated with what Paul was doing in teaching the gospel. It really is a brilliant defense before Felix that he gives.
Sometimes those who speak out are called.
Sorry?
Called ringleaders. Those who
Yep. Well, and words, okay, can words cause somebody to do something violent? If something I say offends you, did that make you be violent towards me? You can choose, but are people going to say things that offend us? We have to be able to control ourselves. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 16 next week. Keep in mind the notes are on the back table for chapters 24 and 25. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.